What if I told you this entire conflict might not just be about war or politics, but about one thing that has shaped global power for more than a century? Oil. Think about it for a moment. As you know, Trump already has influence over Venezuela's oil. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Not Saudi Arabia, not Russia, Venezuela. Now imagine a world where another major oil rival suddenly disappears from the market. Who would dominate global oil then? Iran. And that's where things get interesting. Because Iran is not just another country in the energy game, it produces millions of barrels of oil every single day, exporting most of it to Asia, especially China. And when tensions escalate with Iran, the entire oil market starts shaking. Prices move, markets react, governments panic. So the question people are starting to ask is simple. Is this conflict really about security, or is there a much bigger economic chessboard behind it? Let's break it down. But first, you need to understand something crucial. Oil has always been the invisible force behind global power. For more than 100 years, the countries that control energy supply don't just control fuel. They influence economies. They influence wars. They influence geopolitics. Because energy is not just a commodity, it's leverage. And right now, Iran sits in one of the most powerful positions in the global oil system, not just because of its oil reserves, but because of geography. There is a tiny stretch of water between Iran and Oman called the Strait of Hormuz. It looks small on a map, but this narrow passage handles about 20% of the world's oil supply moving through the sea, 1/5 of global oil, passing through one choke point. Think about how insane that is. If that single corridor gets disrupted, oil prices don't just rise, they explode. And that's exactly what markets fear every time tensions with Iran escalate. In fact, recent strikes and rising tensions have already pushed oil prices upward as traders fear supply disruptions. Because when oil supply becomes uncertain, the entire global economy starts to tremble. Flights become more expensive, shipping costs rise, inflation spikes, gas prices jump, and suddenly a conflict thousands of miles away starts affecting people everywhere. But here's where the bigger strategic question appears. Iran isn't just sitting on oil, it's also positioned to influence the flow of oil from the entire Middle East. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, a huge portion of their exports must pass through the same narrow corridor. That means whoever controls or influences this region has enormous leverage over global energy. Now imagine if a major competitor like Iran were suddenly weakened, sanctioned, isolated, or removed from the global market. What happens then? Supply drops, prices rise, and other producers fill the gap. History shows this pattern over and over. Whenever Iranian oil exports fall due to sanctions or conflict, other oil producers rush in to replace that supply, and those producers make billions. That's why the energy market reacts instantly to geopolitical tensions. When the recent conflict escalated, oil prices surged almost immediately. Not because the oil disappeared overnight, but because traders feared it might. Fear alone can move billions of dollars in energy markets, and this is why some analysts believe energy politics is always operating behind the scenes. Now let's connect this back to Venezuela. Venezuela has something extraordinary, not just oil, but massive untapped oil potential. For years, its production collapsed due to economic crisis and sanctions. But if production were revived with foreign investment and modern infrastructure, Venezuela could flood global markets with crude. That's a strategic asset. Now imagine combining that with rising oil prices caused by instability elsewhere. Suddenly, Venezuelan oil becomes incredibly valuable. And this is why some observers believe energy strategy is always part of the bigger geopolitical puzzle. But here's the key point. That doesn't necessarily mean wars are started purely for oil. Real-world geopolitics is rarely that simple. Instead, it's more like layers of motivations stacked on top of each other. Security concerns, regional power struggles, domestic politics, all mixed together with economic interests. Iran, for example, has been under heavy sanctions for years. The United States has repeatedly tried to reduce Iran's oil exports through what officials call a maximum pressure campaign, aimed at forcing political concessions from Tehran. One of the goals of that strategy has been to drive Iranian oil exports as close to zero as possible. And when those exports fall, the balance of power in the energy market shifts. But Iran hasn't disappeared from the oil market, not even close. Despite sanctions, the country still exports millions of barrels of oil each day. Much of it goes to China, often through indirect trade networks designed to bypass restrictions, which means Iran continues to remain a major player in the global energy system. And that makes the geopolitical stakes extremely high, because this is not just about one country, it's about the balance of energy power across the entire planet. When global oil supply changes, entire economies shift, governments fall, alliances change, markets panic. Even small disruptions can have massive consequences. Remember the Strait of Hormuz? If that passage were closed or even partially blocked, global oil prices could skyrocket to extreme levels. Some analysts warn prices could surge well past $100 per barrel if supply disruptions became serious. That would hit nearly every country on Earth. Because oil isn't just fuel, it's the foundation of modern economies, transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, shipping, almost everything depends on it. So when oil supply becomes uncertain, the ripple effects spread everywhere. And that's why conflicts involving major energy producers attract so much attention. Because behind every headline about missiles, strikes, and diplomacy, there's also an enormous economic chessboard. Countries positioning themselves, markets reacting, energy giants watching closely, and investors trying to predict the next move. But here's something even more fascinating. Sometimes the real impact of a conflict isn't the oil that disappears, it's the oil that becomes more expensive. Because when prices rise sharply, producers around the world benefit. American shale companies increase drilling. OPEC countries gain more revenue. Energy companies see profits surge, and entire financial markets shift. In other words, conflict in one region can reshape the entire global energy economy. This is why oil has always been tied to geopolitics. From World War I to the Gulf War to modern Middle East conflicts, energy supply and global power have always moved together. And the Iran situation sits right at the center of that dynamic. Iran has large reserves, strategic geography, and a long history of tension with Western powers, all of which makes it one of the most complicated players in global politics. So when people ask whether conflicts like this are about oil, the real answer is more nuanced. Oil may not be the only reason, but it's almost always part of the equation, because whoever influences energy supply influences global power, and global power shapes the future. Which brings us back to the original question. If one country gained control over massive oil production in multiple regions, and if rival suppliers were weakened or restricted, could that reshape the global energy hierarchy? Maybe, maybe not. But one thing is certain. In the world of geopolitics, energy is never just fuel. It's strategy, it's leverage, and sometimes it's the hidden force behind the biggest decisions on Earth. So the next time you hear headlines about conflicts in oil-producing regions, don't just look at the surface. Look at the pipelines, look at the shipping routes, look at the markets reacting in real time, because the real story might not be the war itself. It might be the energy game being played underneath it.